Everyone feared her voice, but to me, it sounded like home. They told us the Virelin didn't need weapons, which felt like a stupid thing to say about a species that had accidentally driven a research colony to mass suicide just by asking for directions, but the higher UPS loved that phrase, kept it plastered on briefing screens like it was gospel, and maybe in a way it was, because when someone's voice can scramble your mind like an egg dropped into a nuclear blender, you tend to forgive their lack of guns and missiles, or at least you did until you got sent to clean up the aftermath, which is where I came in, standing ankle-deep in mud and the leftovers of something that used to be a supply station on a planet we never bothered naming properly, just a number and a sector code, because naming places you plan to forget is bad for morale. My name's Eli Grant, Sergeant, Earth Ground Forces Engineering Corps, which basically means I was the guy they sent to dig out collapsed bunkers, patch failing power grids, and figure out why the AI system suddenly thought it was Napoleon. But on that particular day, I had one job: sweep the ruins, identify any tech worth salvaging, and get out before the weather turned the whole valley into a swamp of death, which it absolutely did, because weather on unclaimed planets is like a toddler with a hammer, random, loud, and usually destructive. The cave wasn't on the map, not officially, which should have been a red flag, but I'd learned early on that the universe loves hiding its worst secrets behind poor cartography. So when the drone's echo pinged off something hollow beneath a ridge, I climbed down without asking permission, partly because protocol is for officers with pensions and partly because I was bored and a little curious, which has historically been the first step in every major disaster I've walked into. The entrance was narrow, half swallowed by moss and dirt, but the tunnel opened up fast, revealing a chamber that looked like it had been carved, not by nature, but by hands, or claws, or something with the architectural taste of a sadistic sculptor, because the walls were smooth in places, jagged in others, like someone couldn't decide if they were designing a shelter or a warning, and the only light came from my wrist torch, which meant I didn't see her until I almost stepped on her. She was curled up in the far corner, beneath what looked like an old shock blanket, covered in dust and blood and pieces of her own silence, because she wasn't moving and she wasn't making a sound. And for half a second I thought she was dead, until her eyes opened and stared straight at me, and my brain short-circuited, not because of fear, but because I wasn't supposed to be able to look into the eyes of a Virelin and stay sane. She didn't scream, didn't whisper, didn't make any gesture that could pass for communication, just lay there watching me like I was a ghost, or maybe like she was one, and I froze, trying to remember the emergency protocol for staring into the face of living mythology, which as it turned out was a completely useless collection of bullet points and don'ts that boiled down to run unless you're already drooling, but I didn't run. I crouched, raised both hands, and said the dumbest thing possible, which was, "Hey, you okay?" She didn't answer, of course, but she didn't try to kill me either, so I took that as a good sign. Slowly, deliberately, I unzipped my field bag, pulled out a ration bar, and placed it on the floor between us, then backed off, giving her space like I was trying to coax a wounded animal out of hiding, which wasn't far from the truth, except I'd never met a wounded animal with skin that shimmered like moonlight through water and hair that glowed faintly even in the dark. She looked at the bar, then at me, then back at the bar, and after what felt like a full geological era, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were long, thin, and trembling. She opened the wrapper with an awkwardness that told me she wasn't used to human food, or maybe just hadn't eaten in days, which considering the wreck outside was probably. She didn't say a word the entire ride back to base, which under normal circumstances would have been a cause for celebration considering the last Virelin whisper I heard about had caused a diplomatic attaché to jam a pen through his own eye, but in this case it just made everything feel heavier, like the silence was a loaded weapon she was holding against her own throat. And I wasn't sure if she was refusing to speak out of discipline, fear, injury, or all of the above, but one thing was obvious. From the moment the evac transport touched down in the mud and opened its hatch with that groaning metal hiss that always makes you feel like you're walking into something worse than what you just left, she was a problem, and everyone could smell it. The flight crew looked at her like she was a bomb someone had forgotten to defuse, and I couldn't blame them. Because even with her wrapped in a thermal cloak and huddled into herself like a stray cat in a lightning storm, there was no mistaking those eyes, that skin, That aura of I am not like you and I never will be, and to be fair, she wasn't. The first guy to try restraining her was a corporal named Vix, who probably still thought the war was a game of space invaders, and the second he got within 5 feet she turned and looked at him, and I swear to whatever gods still pick up the phone in this part of the galaxy, he froze like someone had hit his spinal cord with a remote pause button. Didn't scream. Didn't run. Just stared. I had to pull him back myself, which was fun because I got yelled at by the medic for interfering with protocol, and then I got yelled at by command for bringing back a living alien with a history of turning human brains into soup, and finally I got yelled at by the AI logistics system for using the wrong requisition form to request her a blanket, which arguably was the most traumatizing part of the day. They put her in containment room Delta 4, which is basically a euphemism for somewhere soundproof enough to not kill the guards, and they made me sit through a 3-hour debrief with Intelligence Commander Havoc, a woman whose personality could be classified as passive-aggressive laser beam and whose file was thick with stories of making soldiers cry without ever raising her voice. She opened the meeting with a cheerful, "So, Sergeant, tell me how you've managed to bring a doomsday weapon into my base without so much as a verbal clearance." I smiled and said, "Well, technically she didn't say anything, so verbal clearance might be pending." She didn't laugh. Instead, she flicked on a holographic screen showing grainy drone footage of the moment I exited the cave with a girl, zoomed in enough that you could see the faint bruising along the side of her neck and the way she limped, and asked, "Why didn't you neutralize her?" I gave the only answer I had, which was the truth. She didn't attack. She didn't even speak. She took food when offered. Followed orders non-verbally. She's injured and alone. That's not an enemy, that's a survivor. Havoc tapped her fingers against the table like she was playing piano on the bones of dead logic and said, "We have extensive records, Sergeant. The Virelin voice is a Class 3 Chinook hazard. Exposure leads to psychosis, suggestibility, emotional collapse, and in rare cases, spontaneous internal bleeding. You are either extremely lucky or catastrophically compromised." I resisted the urge to say that's what my ex-wife used to say about me and instead just replied, "I've been scanned 3 times. Clean every time. And she still hasn't spoken. Maybe she can't. Maybe that's the point." That got her attention. She sat back, folded her arms, and narrowed her eyes. "You think she's damaged?" "I think she's scared," I said. "Or smart enough to know we're the dangerous ones right now?" She nodded slowly and said, "We'll find out soon enough," which was her way of saying they were about to poke and prod this girl like a science project made of nightmares, and I didn't like it, but I also didn't have any say in the matter. After she pointed at me and wrote those 3 words, "Not to you," something changed in the air. Not like a dramatic music swell or the kind of magical hum you'd expect in a fantasy story about soul bonds and cosmic destinies. No, this was smaller and quieter and more human. The kind of shift you only notice because you suddenly find yourself breathing a little easier even though the room hasn't changed. And I didn't say anything right away because honestly I didn't trust my mouth not to screw it up. So I just nodded and let that moment hang there between us like a fragile thread that neither of us wanted to snap. And she smiled, just a little, not with her mouth but with her eyes and the way her shoulders stopped bracing for disaster, and that was the first time I felt like maybe we were making progress, not just with understanding each other, but with undoing whatever psychic knot the universe had tied between our species, though of course I didn't tell anyone that because the last guy who talked about peace with a Virelin ended up in a psych ward muttering about singing bones and colorless songs, which, to be fair, might have been a great name for a poetry collection if it hadn't come with a side of permanent catatonia. The next few days followed a rhythm that felt almost normal, if you ignored the fact that I was technically living inside a reinforced containment wing with an alien girl whose silence was classified as a potential existential threat. But hey, everyone has weird jobs now and then, and besides, it turned out she was helpful, surprisingly helpful. Like someone who had never been given permission to be useful before and was now discovering the addictive high of fixing broken things, because that's exactly what she did. She fixed things, or more accurately, we fixed them together. It started with a busted filtration unit outside her observation room, A minor malfunction that any tech would have handled in 20 minutes, but I had some time and she was watching me through the glass, so I pulled out my toolkit and started tinkering while explaining what I was doing out loud like an idiot narrating a cooking show for one very quiet viewer, and I didn't expect her to do anything, didn't even expect her to care, but when I looked up, she had picked up the stylus and was drawing something fast and fluid across her pad, and when I glanced at the tablet afterward, I saw a diagram, clean and precise, showing a bypass route I hadn't considered, and it was brilliant, not just functional but elegant in the way engineers dream about late at night when the coffee runs dry and the code starts making sense in colors. So I tried it, and it worked, and I looked back through the glass and gave her a thumbs up, and she actually smiled, a real one this time, faint and unsure, but entirely hers, and that's when it hit me. She wasn't just smart, she was trained, or at least taught, in systems that I didn't recognize but could feel were deeper than anything our engineers had dared to model, and maybe that's what scared everyone about her kind, not the power to destroy, but the potential to understand too much. After that, it became a kind of ritual. I'd bring her broken things, parts from disassembled drones or corrupted processors or even just mangled environmental control systems, and she'd sketch out ideas on her pad while I tried to decipher them, and together we'd make the pieces work again. And it wasn't just therapeutic, it was bonding, and yes, I know how ridiculous that sounds, a soldier bonding with an alien over HVAC schematics, but there it was, real and humming with something I hadn't felt since before the war, the simple act of building something instead of tearing it apart. She started adding little notes to her drawings, not words exactly but icons, visual shorthand for emotion, like a curled line for confusion or a spiral for frustration. And after a while I started responding in kind, leaving doodles next to my tool placements, like a cracked heart when I failed to fix something or a gear with a halo when she improved. I knew the quiet couldn't last forever, and honestly I should have seen it coming the second base sensors started logging anomalies in the comms array. But hindsight is a perfect little jerk like that, and at the time I was too busy watching her fix a busted oxygen converter using nothing but a pair of tweezers and an instinct that made my best engineers look like toddlers with duct tape. So when the first report came in about command staff having vivid auditory hallucinations, I chalked it up to stress or maybe the side effects of being stationed too close to the planetary magnetic field, which had a tendency to make our teeth ache and our dreams weird. But when the reports kept stacking and the hallucinations started sounding similar, I stopped brushing it off. That was the kind of coincidence the universe only handed out when it was loading up a particularly cruel punchline. Sure enough, by day 3, half the tech crew was on medical leave, muttering about voices in their heads. Voices that weren't threatening, but familiar. Voices that sounded like people they loved or missed or had lost years ago. That's when I made the mistake of asking our base AI to run a pattern analysis across the logs, and that smug digital demon came back with a probability matrix showing a 91% chance that all affected personnel had been within 20 meters of me at least once in the last 72 hours. In the grand tradition of military logic, that meant one thing and one thing only. I was the problem. Or more specifically, I was the carrier of the problem, which in some twisted sense made sense, because I had spent more time with her than anyone else. Even if she hadn't said a single word, there was always the possibility that something else was leaking out of her, like background radiation or emotional Bluetooth. The theory got worse when they ran a brain scan on me and found neural activity in the auditory cortex that matched waveforms from known virulent vocal patterns, despite the fact that I hadn't heard her speak. That led to a very awkward meeting with Havoc, who sat me down in a soundproof room and asked, in a tone that suggested she was trying very hard not to punch a wall, if I had any idea what was going on. I told her the truth, which was that no, I didn't know, but yes, I had felt different lately. Not in a dangerous way, but in a clearer, more tuned-in way, like I was walking around with noise-canceling headphones for my soul. That apparently was not the kind of clarity she was hoping for, because she slammed a day-top hat on the table and showed me a transcript of a recent medical interview. One of our junior officers claimed he had heard his dead mother's voice while walking past the observation wing, and her voice had told him he was still loved and to stop drinking. That was arguably good advice, but not the kind of thing you want your intergalactic psychic threat to be responsible for. When I asked if the junior officer was okay, Havoc responded by saying he had checked himself into voluntary stasis until the voices stopped, and that she had 2 more officers requesting the same. As patterns go, it was starting to feel a little too poetic for military personnel. That's when it hit me. Maybe this wasn't her broadcasting anything. Maybe it was me leaking. Maybe just being around her had changed something in my brain, like a tuning fork realigning my inner frequency, and that somehow I was picking up echoes of whatever she kept locked away inside herself. Without realizing it, I was sharing those echoes unintentionally, like a human repeater station. When I proposed that theory to Havoc, she stared at me for a solid 10 seconds, then said I was not an antenna. I replied maybe not, but someone was picking up something, and she better hope it stayed me, because if it started jumping to others, we would not be able to contain it. She did not like that one bit. The only thing more terrifying to Intelligence Command than a silent alien with a weaponized voice was the idea that a human might become the first PD. There is something about knowing you have 72 hours left before someone throws you and the person you care about out an airlock that really sharpens the senses, which is probably why I noticed the anomaly in the patrol logs before anyone else did, because I was already in the mindset of a man preparing for a countdown, not to 0, but to silence. The blip was small, just a single unauthorized ping on the outer perimeter sensors near the East Ravine, where nothing ever happened unless you counted rocks being dramatic, which I didn't. But this blip wasn't a rock, it was heat and motion, and then it was gone. I would have filed it as a glitch if not for the fact that the internal camera network went down for exactly 3 seconds right after and came back with 3 fewer active nodes, which for the uninitiated means someone or something just walked into our system's blind spots and left a calling card. I would have brought this up to Havoc, except that Havoc was busy coordinating the latest psych evaluations after one of the engineers who had stood too close to me during a repair session had a dream that told him how he would die and promptly checked himself into cryo for an indefinite sabbatical. So I decided to do something incredibly smart and simultaneously colossally stupid, which was investigate it myself. Before you get judgmental, just know that in my defense I was on edge from the creeping paranoia building up like mold in the corners of the base, and the only person I trusted to talk to about it was the one person who wasn't allowed to talk. That should have been my first clue that things were unraveling, because when your most reliable confidant is a girl whose voice might liquefy your brain if she sneezes wrong, you have probably taken a few wrong turns on the road to normalcy. I went anyway, loaded up a field pack, grabbed my old multi-tool, and signed myself out under the pretense of checking for weather damage on the antenna array. No one stopped me because most of them were already treating me like a walking question mark with the word unstable blinking above my head like a cheap casino sign. It was quiet out there, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the air is holding its breath, and the deeper I walked into the ravine, the more I realized how much I had been craving that silence. Not the kind she gave me, which was safe and full of meaning, but the raw kind, the kind that didn't ask me to be anything but alone. Then I saw it, a black cylinder half buried in the mud, about the size of my forearm, with a blinking blue light and a tiny emitter coil spinning like it was nervous. I recognized the model instantly. It was a recon pod, but not ours. Not Earth Tech. This was Dominion make, the kind used by independent strike teams who didn't like rules and liked survivors even less. The second I turned around, I knew I wasn't going to be one. There were 3 of them, moving like shadows, not in uniforms, not with insignias, just armored in matte black and carrying suppression rifles with silencer rigs. When I raised my hands, one of them said my name, not as a question but as a greeting. I knew then I wasn't being arrested, I was being erased. The leader stepped forward and said this wasn't personal, and I said that was a relief because I would hate to think I had offended someone. He smirked and said I should have kept my mouth shut about the girl. That was when it all made sense, because of course it wasn't about her being dangerous, it was about her being important. Information like that, in the wrong hands, could shift entire power structures, and someone had decided it was easier to bury the story than risk it leaking. I didn't have time to respond before one of them hit me with a stun round and the world short-circuit into static. I woke up tied to a support beam in one of the maintenance shacks east of the ridge with a pulsing headache and the faint smell of ozone in the air, which usually means someone is preparing something high voltage. I was trying to wiggle free when The thing about being saved by someone who was, up until that moment, categorized as a mobile psychic weapon of mass destruction is that it tends to complicate the paperwork, and the day after she used her voice to put 3 heavily armed professionals into the most peaceful nap of their lives, the base was split into 2 distinct camps, one that wanted to put her in stasis until someone invented a way to surgically mute the soul, and the other that suddenly realized we might be sitting on a diplomatic miracle. And since the latter group included a few high-ranking brass with political ambitions and a working sense of media optics, things escalated faster than I was prepared for, which is saying something because I had gotten pretty good at expecting the worst and still being surprised when the universe managed to outdo itself. So when I was called into a room full of people in tailored uniforms who smiled the kind of smiles that made you check for hidden weapons, I knew we were in for it, and it didn't take long for the word to come down from Central Command. She was no longer classified as a Class 3 threat entity but as a transitional asset under observation and probation, which sounded great until you read the fine print and realized it meant they were going to parade her around as proof that humanity could build bridges across cultures while also keeping her on a leash tight enough to leave marks, and I had exactly 2 choices: either accept my new role as her official liaison and escort her to the proposed neutral zone for interspecies diplomatic debriefing, or step aside and watch them assign someone with fewer morals and more enthusiasm for sedation. So of course I agreed, because I didn't trust anyone else not to ruin what we had somehow built out of broken tech and long silences, and because she trusted me, which in the grand scheme of galactic peace efforts might have been the rarest thing of all, and within 48 hours we were loaded onto a cruiser that looked like it had been dusted off from a museum and staffed with officers who treated me like I had brought a live tiger onto their wedding cake, and her like she might purr or explode depending on how the stars aligned. But she didn't speak, not even once, not during the boarding process, not during the jump, not during the landing at the armistice station known as Orleans Wake, which was essentially a giant floating neutral ground built after the last war and filled with more surveillance systems than crew members, and she just walked beside me with that same quiet grace, her eyes taking in everything but revealing nothing. And I could feel the tension coil tighter with every step we took down those polished halls because no one there wanted to be the one remembered for triggering a diplomatic disaster, and the higher UPS made it clear that this was not about her, or me, or even the truth. It was about control, about appearances, about sculpting a narrative they could sell to a galaxy that still flinched at the mention of Irelin. And I watched her sit across from admirals and ministers and planetary liaisons who smiled too much and asked questions that had no interest in answers, and every time she chose silence, I felt a room itch, as if people were begging her to fail, to slip, to say something they could twist into fear. But she didn't, and neither did I, because I knew what they were trying to do. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted her to become the story, the danger, the legend reborn. And instead she gave them stillness, patience, dignity, and in that vacuum of expected chaos, they started to fumble, to contradict themselves, to reveal their discomfort with someone they couldn't intimidate or categorize, and on the 3rd day of questioning, she stood up, uninvited, walked to the center of the room, and handed me her tablet, the one she had been quietly drawing on since we arrived, and on it was a single diagram. Simple and clean, 2 overlapping circles, one labeled harm, the other labeled hope, and at the intersection a tiny star, A. It turns out that once you redefine someone from threat to asset and then from asset to emissary, the scientific community shows up like a swarm of overly polite locusts dressed in lab coats and armed with consent forms that use the word optional in the same way a buffet uses the word limit. And even though the agreement stated she would not be subjected to involuntary testing, the reality of station politics meant that a lot of things were technically voluntary but came with a kind of pressure that made saying no feel like declaring war, and at first she complied, not because she trusted them but because she wanted to learn what they feared about her and maybe prove them wrong. And the tests started simple: response time evaluations, emotional recognition drills, passive neural scans while she listened to ambient noise, things designed to measure whether her silence was stable or simply a dam waiting to crack, and she let them take readings and run simulations and point little blinking machines at her as long as I was in the room, which I always was, because the second I stepped out, the tone changed, the smiles tightened, and the questions became more pointed, and it didn't take long before they started pushing boundaries, subtle at first, like extending test duration without notice or increasing the stimulus intensity to see if she would flinch, and when she didn't, they called it tolerance, but I called it restraint, because I could see it in the way her hands curled just a little too tightly in her lap, or how her eyes stayed fixed on mine like she was reminding herself she wasn't alone. And then came the empathy simulations, which sounded harmless and even noble on paper, scenarios built to test emotional response and identification across species barriers, but the execution was anything but harmless, because someone in behavioral analysis decided the best way to test her capacity for compassion was to put her in a room with a child simulation crying in the corner, or an injured figure gasping for help, or a loop of someone screaming in a language she didn't understand, and then they measured the changes in her brainwave patterns to determine whether her response was appropriate. And I sat through these sessions with a growing sense of nausea, because even though it was all fake, none of it felt fake to her, and I saw it when she reached out for a projected figure only to pass through it like smoke, or when she placed her hands on her own ears trying to drown out the pain of something that didn't exist. And after one particularly awful session where they showed her a recording of a virulent child being dragged away by soldiers, she looked at me with a face so hollowed out by grief that I almost broke protocol and shut it down myself. And afterward she wouldn't look at anyone for 3 days, wouldn't draw, wouldn't speak, just stared at the ceiling like she was afraid to close her eyes, and I had to go to the ethics board, which was less a board and more a cluster of bureaucrats who had mastered the art of frowning without meaning anything. And I told them that if they continued treating her like a puzzle box with a trauma trigger instead of a person, I was going to make sure the interspecies oversight committee heard about it. And they reminded me that she was still legally classified as an unknown risk, and I reminded them that so was every other diplomat on that station, and unless they were planning on running empathy drills on the ambassador from Tal Soren using holograms of his dead spouse, they needed to back off, and eventually they did, reluctantly. Not because they agreed with me, but because they realized they couldn't predict how she would react if they pushed her too far, and more importantly they couldn't predict how I would react either. And after that the tests became less invasive, more collaborative, and she started speaking again, not in words but in presence, in the way she joined the station's education sessions, not as a subject but as a listener, sometimes even as a silent co-teacher when they There is something about anticipation that eats at the corners of your mind more than the actual moment ever does, and over the following days after she gave me her name and sound, I started to notice it in the little things, not fear exactly, but expectation, from the way people paused before greeting her, to the subtle shift in tone when officers asked me for updates, like they were waiting for something seismic and not entirely sure whether they wanted it to arrive or remain hypothetical. I knew it was because they had started to believe she might actually speak, not just resonate or hum or share notes through harmonics, but truly speak aloud, in a language that could be recorded and analyzed and dissected, and I hated how quickly their curiosity turned into hunger, like this moment of possibility was a locked door and they were already counting the ways they could break it open. She did not seem rushed by it. She still spent her afternoons in the botanical wing, adjusting the tones of the battery plants to make them bloom in patterns she claimed were emotional fractals. She still traced my hand with her finger in quiet thanks after we repaired another communications conduit that kept translating her presence as signal interference, and she still chose silence every time someone tried to bait her into a demonstration, as if she was the only one who understood that power wielded gently was still power. It was on one of those afternoons, when the station's artificial sunlight made everything look too peaceful to be real, that she asked me if I would walk with her outside, not into vacuum obviously, but into the unpressurized walk chamber where simulations of planetary environments were used for stress testing and training. I said yes. Of course I said yes, and we suited up and walked under the simulated twilight sky of a long dead moon, while the station played soft ambient gravity and distant wind, and she reached out and took my hand. Not because she needed support, but because she wanted to. After everything we had been through, the simplicity of that gesture was the most destabilizing thing I had ever experienced. We stood there for a long time under a sky that never moved, while she stared out into nothing and I stared at her, wondering what she saw in that carefully rendered horizon. Then she turned to me and tilted her head, like she always did when she was about to ask something important, and I nodded before she even lifted her hand, because I already knew I would say yes to whatever it was. She placed her gloved fingers against the COMM patch of my suit and then to hers and activated the local audio link between us, and her voice came through, soft and imperfect and so achingly human that it nearly brought me to my knees. All she said was one word. Eli. It wasn't just my name. It was something else, something wrapped in meaning and gravity and memory and hope. It was every moment we had shared, compressed into a sound I had only heard once before and never thought I would hear again. I didn't say anything at first, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. I was holding so much in that one syllable that it felt like I had forgotten how to respond to kindness. When I finally managed to speak, all I said was, "Say it again." She did. I laughed and cried at the same time, because no sound in the galaxy had ever been worth more than that. Not a victory speech, not a diplomatic address, not even the songs of her people before the war. The way she looked at me afterward, like she had just dropped every shield she had ever built and was waiting for me to catch her, was the moment I knew that whatever happened next, I would never be able to walk away from this, not because I owed her, or because she had saved me, but because something had been spoken into existence between us and now it lived and breathed and waited. I knew it was not going to stay a secret for long, and I was right, because the comms system logged our local audio and flagged the anomaly within seconds, and within 10 minutes station command H. Being the only human who could hear her voice without going mad used to feel like a strange blessing. Now, it felt more like a bullseye painted on my back. Because once people stopped fearing something, they started wanting it, and once they wanted it, they would do anything to own it. When she first spoke that single word in the open, it changed everything. It was soft, warm, human even, but it lit up every surveillance grid in the station. At first, people were cautious. Then they were curious. Then they were ravenous. Researchers showed up pretending to be diplomats. Soldiers showed up pretending to be bodyguards. Strategists arrived pretending to be peace advocates. All of them were asking the same thing, just with different smiles. What else can she do? Can she manipulate sound fields? Could she subdue riots with tone? Could she disable enemy drones? Could her voice be tuned, trained, scaled? I told them she wasn't a weapon, and definitely not a product, but they smiled at me like I was a child clinging to a rock while the tide came in. The worst part was, I knew that smile. I had worn that smile back in the war, when I scouted ruins for things that made killing easier. I saw the signs creeping in. The station upgraded its comms array overnight. Extra cameras popped up in our hallway. The food deliveries came later. The guards started logging in from security terminals closer to our room. Then, one morning, I found a small hovering drone in our quarters, aimed squarely at her while she slept. I didn't report it. I smashed it against the wall, left its corpse outside the captain's office, and wrote a note, "She's not yours." No one said anything, but the pressure changed. It got softer, more polite, and more relentless. We received formal invitations from research boards and cultural liaisons. They called them conversations. I called them what they were, offers wrapped in velvet threats. One said we'd receive immunity. Another said they'd build her a sanctuary. One even said they'd protect her voice in exchange for just one sample. Just one. I laughed when I read that one. Like you could extract the soul from someone and keep the rest alive. She watched me read them all and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "I want to go home." And I realized that I didn't even know what that meant anymore. Her world was gone. Her people scattered or dead. Her language banned in most sectors. "There is no home," I told her. "Then take me somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere I can just be." I promised her I would. And for once, I kept my promise the same day I made it. We left that night with forged credentials and an old freighter manifest rerouted under a junker ID. I had a friend who owed me. He didn't ask questions. just nodded, handed me a data key, and walked away. We took nothing but clothes, a portable resonance damper, and a backup of her vocal signature encrypted on a drive I vowed never to use. The ship was loud, slow, and smelled like rusted metal and recycled air, but it got us out. When we broke orbit and entered slip space, I felt like I exhaled for the first time in weeks. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes and leaned her head on my shoulder like the weight she carried had finally gone silent. We arrived at an abandoned relay station orbiting a dead moon. No life, no scans, no questions. Just us, the stars, and whatever fragments of ourselves we could keep together. Inside the station's control dome, we set up camp. Dust covered everything. The lights flickered. The oxygen scrubbers hummed like old ghosts. But it was ours. She slept without flinching. I stopped dreaming in tactical patterns. We cooked from ration packs. We sang softly, badly, but with smiles. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was poetry. One night, she asked, "Do you think they'll ever stop wanting it?" "Your voice?" I asked. "Yes," she said. I didn't answer right away. "No," I said finally. "They won't? Because you're the only thing in the galaxy that can touch a mind without permission." She nodded. We didn't speak for a long time after the third probe. Silence became our language again, and in that silence, I could feel the slow, inevitable approach of something much larger than us. The kind of thing that moves through politics and power without ever showing its face. It didn't need to. When someone out there decides that a person is valuable, that value becomes a target. They didn't care that she was a living being. They didn't care that she had thoughts, feelings, memories of a culture now wiped from the stars. They only cared that she had a voice unlike anything they could control, and if they couldn't control it, they'd try to replicate it, and if they couldn't replicate it, they'd try to extract it. In one form or another. I started sleeping lighter. I kept the old phase rifle charged and tucked behind the console. She didn't ask about it. She just curled up beside me every night and held my wrist like she was anchoring herself in place, as if she was afraid she might dissolve if I let go. Some nights, I thought maybe I would. But then she would hum, barely above the vibration of thought, and I would come back. Always. One morning, she stood by the observation window, the same place she always liked to watch the stars, and said something I hadn't heard before. "I dreamed I was singing," she said. "Not words, just sound. The kind that makes the dark go away." I stood beside her and asked if it scared her. She shook her head. "It felt like breathing," she said. "Like I was finally whole again." That stayed with me. For all the time I had known her, I had never really thought about what it cost her to stay quiet. To live inside silence because the alternative was terror. She wasn't hiding from war. She was hiding from herself. And now she was trying to come back. That day, we repaired a broken console in the control dome together. We didn't talk about the probes or the possibility of another message. We just worked, side by side, sharing tools and nods. She made a sound when I dropped a panel on my foot. It was half a laugh, half a gasp, and it was beautiful. We had a dinner of reheated protein slabs and recycled water, but it tasted better than most feasts. Afterward, she took my hand and pulled me to the center of the room. There was no music. No lights. Just us. She placed my hands on her shoulders, rested hers on my chest, and said, "In my culture, this was how we danced when we couldn't use our voices. So we danced. Badly. Awkwardly. Slowly. But we danced." I told her I didn't know the steps. She said, "Neither do I. That's what makes it ours." The next morning, the stars looked different. A cruiser appeared just past the edge of the moon's shadow. It didn't hail us. It didn't scan. It just lingered. Watching. Waiting. We knew what it was. A listening ship. A quiet threat. I looked at her and said we could go. We still had the jump coordinates to the last place the Galactic Accords didn't patrol. She looked at me and asked, "Will you follow me anywhere?" I said yes. Without hesitation. "Even if I speak?" she asked. I reached up and touched her cheek. "Especially if you speak." That night, we packed what we needed, which was very little. She carried a memory crystal around her neck, etched with the history of her people. I carried the rifle. We took the backup pod out from the relay's lower dock. The escape path was pre-programmed. The engines sputtered at first, then roared. I looked back once at the station. Our home. Our silence. And I let it go. The jump drive took us further than I expected. Out past the known sectors. Into cold space. Real cold. The kind of cold that forgets light. The pod drifted until we found it. A satellite remnant orbiting a dead world. Old tech. Untraceable. But functional. We docked. We lived. And for 3 days, no one came. On the 4th day, she woke me with her voice. Not words. Just a sound. A hum. It flowed through the air like liquid light. I opened my eyes and stared at her. She was standing by the console, her skin glowing faintly with a resonance I had only seen once.